While I was writing some of my other recent videos, I realized I was getting at the edges of an idea that I know pretty well at this point, but I've never actually discussed on the channel. I know I once had a fair number of libertarian followers at one point during the lockdowns, though I think a lot of them have since moved on, and now they're in the comment sections on other channels shrieking that I'm a statist or a communist for betraying them. That's always kind of funny to see. However, it's important to point out that although I have read a fair bit of libertarian and anarcho-capitalist political theory, and I've discussed those ideas at length in many previous videos, I don't actually subscribe to those ideas, and I certainly don't think of myself as a libertarian. In fact, although libertarian thinkers have had some good criticisms of the current liberal, capitalist, democratic world order, libertarian philosophy is ultimately deeply flawed. Probably the most important realization that I've come to over the years is that libertarianism fails for the same reasons and in the same way as socialism does. Let's once again begin with basic definitions. Libertarianism is a political philosophy that places a strong emphasis on the value of liberty. Libertarians often oppose authority, state power, warfare, militarism, and nationalism, but some libertarians diverge in the scope of their opposition to existing economic and political systems. Scholars have identified distinct libertarian perspectives on the nature of property and capital, typically delineating them along the left-right or socialist-capitalist axis. Right off, we have to go over an important bit of history. The French anarcho-communist Joseph de Jacques was the first person to coin the term libertarian. He used the word to describe his view that individual liberty can only truly exist when both capitalism and the state were abolished, as the state was the military and financial guarantor of the capitalist system. However, by the end of the Second World War, the word libertarian was used in the United States to refer not to anarcho-communist adjacent ideas, but anarcho-capitalist adjacent ones. This type of libertarian believed that the state was the military and financial guarantor not of a free market capitalist system, which they preferred, but of command economies and state socialism. Over time, it was this right libertarianism that became the dominant form of libertarianism, while left libertarians retreated to older terms like anarchist. Murray Rothbard, one of the most influential ANCAP thinkers, directly admitted his movement had successfully co-opted the term libertarian from the left anarchists, and didn't actually have an original claim to it. In his book, The Betrayal of the American Right, Rothbard wrote, "One gratifying aspect of our rise to some prominence is that, for the first time in my memory, we, our side, had captured a crucial word from the enemy. Other words, such as liberal, had originally been identified with laissez-faire libertarians, but had been captured by left-wing statists, forcing us in the 1940s to call ourselves, rather feebly, true or classical liberals. Libertarian, in contrast, had long been simply a polite word for left-wing anarchists. That is, for anti-private property anarchists, either of the communist or syndicalist variety. But now we have taken it over, and more properly from the view of etymology, since we were proponents of individual liberty, and therefore of the individual's right to his property." Right after this quote, Rothbard mentions that some libertarians at this time still preferred to use the label individualist instead, which many libertarians today still do, especially when they call anyone who disagrees with them collectivist. This is a conflict I've described many times before on this channel already, the divide between left and right anarchists, where they both view the other as not truly being anarchists. Left anarchists think the right anarchist support of capitalism means they're not truly oriented towards freedom, since hierarchy and corporations require the state to restrict the common person. Right anarchists think the left anarchist support of socialism means they're not truly oriented towards freedom, since equality and collective ownership require the state to restrict the common person. And they're both correct on some level. If you've ever listened to a breadtuber talk to or about libertarians, they often use this point as the main thrust of their attack. And if you ever heard libertarian socialist or left anarchist channels talk about their view of the oppression of the state, you'll notice that, for a good long while, they actually kind of sound like American-styled right libertarians.
Representative democracy promotes the idea that our only way of wielding power is by choosing who will represent us. This discourages us from learning how to wield power for ourselves. Democracy is not alone in this, even if it may be more effective in its illusions. All governing institutions constrain individuals into passivity and subjugation. The idea that common people are active participants in a well-meaning political system is a comforting lie, which serves to hide the fact that we are, more or less, merely spectators of a rat race between the people in charge. We must understand and confront how various institutions use representation to keep us divided, weak, and tied to the dominant system. Politicians, corporations, media outlets, organized religions, and nonprofits continue to spread dangerous ideologies.
Until they don't, anyway.
Neoliberalism has transformed political representation from a framework to address racism, sexism, and all other forms of injustice that thrive within capitalism into a demand to diversify the political and economic elite without addressing the massive wealth and income inequalities that form the material foundation of oppression.
Rothbard makes the claim that his camp's use of libertarian is closer to the true meaning of the word, while left libertarians routinely say, actually, libertarianism is originally leftist, and even though we're all about redefining words to suit the modern era, we reject it here because this time we're the ones who took the L. Okay, guys. However, once again, I think they're both wrong. Right libertarianism is often called American libertarianism because it developed in the United States, and its seeds can be found in the westward expansion era. American anti-government thought developed in a more artisanal and homesteadist direction because of the geographical fact that America had a shit ton of mostly unsettled land, and the American government was happy to respect the claims of enterprising individuals who ran out into the wilderness and settled it themselves. Meanwhile, left libertarianism is often called European libertarianism because it developed in Europe, without any large empty tracts of land for peasants to flee into in order to escape the authority of a centralized government. As a result, these libertarians developed more communal-oriented theories regarding how large, downtrodden, immobile populations could band together in collective action to revolt against a tyrannical state. And as America's unclaimed land was eventually all staked off, left libertarian sentiment began to slowly rise in the United States as well. As a quick side note, I think this is one of the reasons why left libertarians hate the idea of colonizing space, screaming constantly that the rich shouldn't be wasting their money on space-related innovations when we have enough problems here on Earth already. Materially, colonizing space is significantly harder than colonizing a new continent, so fair enough. But philosophically, space colonization represents a new frontier of anti-government action that exists conceptually outside the bounds of the socialist project. But this is just a hunch on my part. The point that I'm making here is that libertarian socialists and libertarian capitalists are related ideologies. They both claim to be aiming at liberty. If you ask a libertarian capitalist, he'll say that freedom is his goal. If you ask a libertarian socialist, he'll also say that freedom is his goal. If you were to ask both of them why, they'll also give similar answers. Some libertarian capitalists will say that freedom is a moral good, and so will some libertarian socialists. Other libertarian capitalists will say that exclusively owning your own property and only consenting to voluntary interactions with other people is maximally free and will also result in greater material wealth for the individual. Libertarian socialists will claim that nothing can truly be voluntary if the individual is coerced by the influences of the capitalist class, and that communities collectively owning their property and mutually laboring for each other's sake within it is maximally free and will also result in greater material wealth for the individual. What this means is that libertarian capitalists and libertarian socialists have the same stated goals. They differ greatly in method, so much so that they are outwardly mortal enemies, but they're both aiming at the same thing. They both hold the same values, freedom above all else, but they are radically different in how they believe greater freedom can be achieved. This is why whenever I've watched a breadtuber like Vosh debate a libertarian, he always says something like, "You like freedom, right? Well, me too. I just like it more than you do. I want freedom for the workers in the workplace. There's way more workers than owners, so I want more freedom than you do." And philosophically, Vosh is more correct. The problem lies in that pursuit of freedom in the first place. In a recent video, I spoke about negative and positive rights. We have to dig a little bit deeper on that topic, because despite how much libertarians and some liberals love the idea, it turns out it doesn't actually work all that well. Yes, I get it. Negative rights exist in a vacuum, man a state of nature. Positive rights are negotiated between people, governments, civil rights. I get it. But that's ultimately the wrong way to think about it. The idea of negative and positive rights was first formulated by Isaiah Berlin in a lecture he gave at Oxford titled Two Concepts of Liberty. Berlin defined negative liberty as the area within which the subject is, or should be, left to do or be what he is able, without interference from other persons. And he defined positive liberty as the source of control or interference that can determine someone to do or be this rather than that. To put it more simply, negative rights are properly worded as freedom from, the freedom from external restraint, while positive rights are properly worded as freedom to, the freedom to positively take an action. Take free speech rights, for example. Free speech is generally considered a negative right, the freedom from the grasp of the censor. But it can also be formulated as a positive right, the freedom to speak, the freedom to perform the action of speaking. Let's do the same thing for a common positive right, like the right to education. This can be worded as the freedom to be educated, but it can also be worded as the freedom from a lack of education. Careful examination of every negative and positive right shows that they generate their own counterpart, and that counterpart must exist in a practical sense for the right to function. The libertarian might cry foul at the collapsing of positive and negative rights into one thing, saying that one of them infringes on people and the other doesn't. And this critique feels intuitively true even to me, but it doesn't stand up to rational scrutiny. Think about it. If I have the right to self-defense, then in practical terms I have negative freedom, the freedom from an unprovoked attack from you. And I also have positive freedom, the freedom to stop your attack with my defense. In reality, all rights, whether they're considered positive or negative, function the same way. They place an obligation on other people to not infringe them. That obligation itself becomes an infringement on the other person, and it's here that the distinction between them falls away. Again, the libertarian might object, saying that there is a moral basis for considering the freedom to aggress upon others as not a true freedom, citing the non-aggression principle. But that's a moral claim, not a description of what an individual can actually do in a vacuum, which is what the libertarian notion of negative freedoms are in the first place. In practical, real-world terms, you simply do have the freedom to attack other people, if you have the ability to do so. And so the libertarian must restrict that freedom in the pursuit of other freedoms. In this way, the NAP is revealed as a sleight-of-hand trick. It's a moral judgment designed to get the listener to not notice the contradiction, which is a trick that many ideologies before it have also played. This is one reason why I find libertarianism to be unconvincing. Its determination of which rights to uphold and which not to is dependent on who the aggressor is, which is itself a moral judgment based in libertarian values. In other words, you have to already be bought into the libertarian view of morality in order to accept that the NAP renders the right to be aggressive as immoral. But a socialist who isn't bought into that morality doesn't give a shit. His morality isn't concerned with who is the aggressor, but instead who is the oppressor. The socialist will say that a member of the oppressed class striking out against his oppressor already presupposes a previous level of structural aggression. And the libertarian capitalist and libertarian socialist will argue over the minutiae of what is fundamentally the same core idea. I lay all of this out to make the point that the values libertarian capitalists claim as their own, those are also libertarian socialist values. Ludwig von Mises was primarily concerned with increasing material wealth, and he viewed capitalist ideas as being the best way to go about it. Milton Friedman believed that the libertarian capitalist impulse towards limiting government and corporations was mainly to ensure equality of opportunity. And Rothbard believed that freedom was the ultimate value in and of itself. But like I said at the start of the video, what differs between libertarian capitalists and libertarian socialists is not what they desire, but the methods they use to achieve their goals. They both prioritize material prosperity, equality of opportunity, and freedom. But libertarian socialists do not believe that Mises' ideas will create prosperity. Instead, collective ownership will. They don't believe that Friedman's ideas will create equality. Instead, abolishing classes will. They don't believe that Rothbard's ideas will create freedom. Instead, democratizing the workplace will. Libertarian socialists and libertarian capitalists have very different views, but they ultimately value the same things and operate within the same philosophical frame. In fact, in a weird way, the relationship between the two ideologies is like the embodiment of the collapse of the distinction between positive and negative rights, as if the two philosophies are themselves avatars of that process playing out. Consider, for example, the libertarian demand for liberation from traditional sexual morality, at least in the privacy of your own home. The state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. Fair enough. But this is a freedom from argument, the freedom from outside forces coming in and restricting your private life based on some morality that you don't follow. And now look at the other side of the coin. Go back to my video on the extremist trans activist who declared she had to have sex with all of her friends, including the ones with AIDS, because it wouldn't be equal if she refused them, and her freedom required that she be provided with anti-AIDS drugs. That's now a positive freedom, the freedom to fuck anyone you like, consequence-free. Once you notice how these dichotomies function, it becomes very easy to see them in action. The freedom from religious people or the state, preventing you from transitioning, becomes the freedom to transition, often at the taxpayer's expense. The freedom from police arresting you for doing drugs becomes the freedom to do drugs in the middle of the street with no thought to public decency. I want to make it clear here, I'm not making any moral arguments. Personally, I don't care if you do any of this stuff. I'm simply laying out the logic. The libertarians set up the freedom from argument, and the socialists build upon it with a corresponding freedom to argument, using the same logic and aiming at the same goals. In the final analysis, the libertarians always baton pass to the socialists, whether they intend to or not. Now I can already hear the voice of Sargon chirping in my ear. Dev, this logic can be used against liberals too. And you know, it can be, to a point. This is a reformulation of the flaw of liberalism. However, for libertarians, it is significantly more extreme, because libertarians have no limiting mechanism to prevent socialists from building upon their projects. Liberals actually do have these mechanisms, though progressives have been doing their best to dismantle them. The limits are found in the liberals' greater respect for functioning institutions, the very things that libertarians tend to want to abolish. The best way I've seen this described is by Professor Stephen Hicks, in his defense of liberalism against this very Sargonian accusation.
One of the, I thought, more persuasive criticisms of liberalism, and we heard it, a lot of it at ARC, where we all were a few days ago, was that limits are liberating and the pursuit of unending freedom is actually destructive to society. What do you say to those people?
Well, I think you have to start with a moral conception of what society is. We start with individuals who are both the agents. Individuals have agency. You don't see them as pawns pushed around by forces beyond their control. So there is a conception of human nature at work, and that's a philosophical starting point. Not only of agents, but of moral worth. That whatever we're doing in society, that we're forming various kinds of social institutions, businesses, religions, families, governments, and so forth, it is with respect to the value of the individuals involved. So we come together to do business as individuals. We form families. It's two individuals who come together, making a voluntary choice, and they then bring into the world another individual, right, that needs to develop his capacities for agency and moral self-responsibility. So it's not that freedom and individualism is corrosive of the social. It's rather that the social exists to preserve the individuals and enable individuals better by division of labor being coordinated, achieve the values of the individual. When those social institutions are no longer serving that function, they should properly be dissolved. And this and new ones created, and this is partly why we're going to have an evolving and in some case revolving society. So it is making clear what your ultimate moral standard is. Some social institutions should be dissolved, but that requires that you've made clear what your moral standard is, and you should have no problem with some social institutions going by the by. And you should be actively preserving other social institutions because they've proved their worth at protecting the rights and values of the individual.
By the way, this debate between Professor Hicks and Professor James Orr, the conservative, is actually a really good one, because these two guys are alike enough that they can have a real conversation. They're using the same terminology and they exist in the same reality, unlike a lot of extremists nowadays. But they're also different in a lot of ways. At one point, Hicks makes the claim that he's more of a Lockean liberal, while Orr is more of a Burkean conservative. And considering that I have great respect for both Locke and Burke, it's no wonder that I found both of these guys to basically be on the money the whole time, and it becomes quite easy to synthesize their ideas. That synthesis is why I'm not a libertarian, or a socialist or a progressive, but a liberal conservative. I'm not interested in pursuing an ever-expanding freedom as a part of a continual march of progress. I'm conservative in that I do want to conserve my culture, my country, my way of life. I do look at change simply for the sake of change quite skeptically, but I'm still a liberal because the culture that I want to conserve is a liberal culture. I want Hicks's muscular liberalism, willing to proactively enforce its own values and standards and not be cucked by the paradox of tolerance. I do actually want what the reactionaries derisively call progress going the speed limit, because the problem we have right now is progressives continually going way too fast and wrapping the car around a tree over and over. I'm not ideologically devoted to the tenets of liberalism, always wanting more freedom and more equality regardless of circumstance, because that again leads down the blind march of progress. But I do like liberal values, and I do want to see them propagated where appropriate, while still being skeptical of their excesses. Libertarians don't want to hear it, but it's their ideas are where those excesses are found. Alright, that about does it for me, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're watching it on release, right when it comes out, I'll be over on my friend Mauler's channel doing an EFAP on that terrible game, Star Wars Outlaws. Drop by and say hi. I will see you over there. Have a good one, guys. I love you.